If you had asked me a year ago what the defining sound of a perfect summer was, I would have told you it was the rhythmic, gentle splashing of my kids diving into the crystal-clear, chlorinated sanctuary of our backyard pool, a sound that cut through the oppressive, suffocating heat of Orlando, Florida, like a cold blade of pure joy. My home, nestled deeply within the manicured, eerily uniform streets of Cypress Creek Estates, was my absolute castle, and that pool was its beating heart, the epicenter of neighborhood barbecues, the backdrop to countless sun-drenched memories, and a sparkling oasis that I had meticulously maintained with the kind of obsessive, loving devotion most people reserve for classic cars or newborn children. But the illusion of my peaceful suburban utopia was violently shattered on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, not by a natural disaster or a sudden calamity, but by a single, aggressively neon yellow piece of paper taped to my mailbox, a color so violently loud it seemed to clash with the very concept of nature itself. The flyer, stamped with the imposing, soulless crest of the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association, was a declaration of war disguised as a community update, its bold, capitalized letters screaming out a brand new, unilaterally decided regulation, an absolute, uncompromising prohibition on all swimming pools, both above ground and in-ground, effective immediately. I remember standing there in the driveway, the humid Florida air suddenly feeling heavy and unbreathable, as a sickening knot of pure, unadulterated dread twisted violently in my stomach, my eyes darting across the bureaucratic jargon that condemned my beautiful, perfectly tiled oasis as an unsightly disruption to our cohesive neighborhood aesthetic. It was completely, utterly preposterous, a ruling so detached from reality that I initially thought it was a cruel prank, because my pool wasn't just a concrete hole filled with water, it was the very glue that held our local community together, a place where exhausted parents found respite and neighborhood kids forged lifelong friendships over floating flamingos and melted popsicles. But as I read the agonizingly tiny fine print at the bottom of that cursed yellow page, the devastating reality set in, revealing that this wasn't just a ban on future construction, it was a retroactive death sentence for my property, demanding the complete filling and removal of my pool within a mere 30 days, accompanied by the looming, terrifying threat of compounding daily fines that could easily bankrupt a working family, and ominous warnings of aggressive legal action that would undoubtedly result in liens placed against my home. This draconian nightmare was the direct, malicious brainchild of Brenda Vance, a woman who had recently clawed her way to the presidency of the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association, a terrifyingly bored, power-hungry local tyrant who patrolled the streets in her immaculate, silver Lexus RX, wielding her clipboard like a broadsword and viewing any display of individual joy or personal expression as a direct, unforgivable insult to her obsessive, beige-colored vision of suburban perfection. Brenda had a notorious, well-documented vendetta against anything that dared to stand out, and this pool ban was her magnum opus, a blatant, unchecked power grab designed to bend the entire neighborhood to her iron will. But more importantly, I knew deep down in my bones that it was a deeply personal, targeted strike against me, a punishment for the audacity I had to host loud, joyous gatherings that occasionally echoed over her pristine, silent, joyless property line. The sheer, suffocating injustice of it all burned through my veins like battery acid, replacing the cold dread in my stomach with a white-hot, simmering rage, a refusal to simply roll over and let this suburban dictator bulldoze the sanctuary I had built for my family with my own two hands. I sat on my patio that evening, staring out at the gentle ripples of the pool reflecting the fading twilight. The cruel yellow flyer crumpled in my fist, and as the anger gave way to a cold, calculating clarity, a slow, dangerous smile began to creep across my face, stretching into a grin of pure, unadulterated pettiness. Brenda Vance had boldly declared that my pool was destroying the harmony of the neighborhood. She had weaponized the bylaws to erase my joy, and so, I decided in that quiet, defining moment, that if she wanted me to remove my pool to comply with her twisted vision of community standards, I would give her exactly what she asked for, but I would do it in a way that would fundamentally shatter her carefully controlled reality. If I was legally barred from possessing a conventional swimming pool, I would simply have to pivot, I would have to think on a scale so massive, so ridiculously ancient and aggressive, that it would leave the entire HOA board paralyzed with confusion. I was going to build a moat. It was a profoundly ridiculous idea, a concept so absurdly petty and grandiose that it sparked in my mind like a rogue, brilliant firework, painting a vivid picture of a massive, defensive trench encircling the entirety of my property line, a medieval middle finger pointed directly at the heart of the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association. The very next morning, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of dark roast coffee and a burning thirst for righteous vengeance, I began making the calls that would set my absurd masterpiece into motion, eventually connecting with Mike, the bulldozer Henderson, the gruff, heavily bearded owner of Orlando Earthworks, a local excavation company renowned for taking on the kind of bizarre, heavily customized landscaping jobs that other, more corporate contractors would run away from. When Mike pulled up to my driveway in his battered, mud-splattered work truck, I laid out the blueprints of my madness, pointing to the property lines and tracing the massive, sweeping perimeter I wanted excavated. He looked at the plans, scratched his calloused chin, and asked in a low, rumbling voice if I was sure I wanted a trench this deep, to which I locked eyes with him and whispered that it needed to be wider, deeper, and overwhelmingly defensive, something that screamed medieval fortification. Mike just stared at me for a long, quiet moment, the gears turning in his head, before a massive, wicked grin split through his beard, and he chuckled a deep, resonant laugh, telling me he absolutely loved my style. And right then and there, the contract was signed, the deposit was paid, and the countdown to Brenda Vance's ultimate unraveling officially began. The earth began to shake exactly 1 week later, the tranquil morning silence of Cypress Creek estates violently ruptured by the deep, guttural roar of massive, heavy-duty excavators rolling onto my lawn, their giant yellow steel buckets biting deeply into the rich Florida soil, scooping out thousands of pounds of dirt in a single, terrifyingly efficient motion. The neighborhood was instantly abuzz, curtains twitching in every window, neighbors stepping cautiously out onto their driveways with steaming mugs of coffee to watch the spectacle unfold with a potent mixture of raw curiosity and deep, unspoken concern, wondering what on earth I was doing destroying my own property. Naturally, it didn't take long for Brenda Vance to make her appearance, her silver Lexus RX slowing to a menacing crawl as it passed my house, her perfectly coiffed hair practically vibrating with indignation as she leaned out the window, frantically scribbling notes on her infamous clipboard, muttering loudly to her terrified passenger, the HOA vice president, trying to decipher the chaos. I could hear them speculating over the deafening roar of the diesel engines, the vice president suggesting with a nervous, sarcastic laugh that I was perhaps installing an oversized, pretentious Zen garden, to which Brenda merely scoffed, her nose turned up in pure disgust, completely oblivious to the historical, architectural warfare that was currently being etched into the ground beneath her tires. I just stood on my porch, holding a glass of iced tea, smiling warmly and waving at them with the serene, untouchable confidence of a man who knows he is holding a royal flush, letting them marinate in their false assumptions, letting them believe I was just having a midlife crisis manifested through eccentric landscaping, knowing full well they couldn't even begin to comprehend the sheer scale of the glorious, petty devastation that was rapidly approaching. Day by day, the trench grew exponentially, stretching wider and plunging deeper, wrapping its gaping, cavernous arms around my home in a protective, unyielding embrace, a massive, muddy chasm that stood as a stark, unavoidable monument to my absolute refusal to bow to tyrannical homeowner regulations. Once the digging was finally complete, the real magic began, as a fleet of massive commercial water trucks arrived, pumping thousands of gallons of fresh water into the enormous ditch, transforming the dusty, barren crater into a shimmering, reflective, awe-inspiring body of water that completely isolated my house from the surrounding neighborhood. When the water settled, the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association collectively lost their minds, the reality of my actions crashing down upon them like a tidal wave, prompting Brenda Vance to actually sprint across the street, her heels clicking frantically on the pavement, her voice reaching an ear-piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed across the newly formed surface of my moat. She stood on the far edge of the water, her face a terrifying, mottled shade of crimson, screaming that this was an absolute outrage, an unsightly, preposterous violation of every moral and aesthetic code the community stood for, her arms flailing wildly as she demanded I fill it in immediately. I leaned casually against a newly installed wooden post, feigning total, innocent confusion, and softly suggested that it actually tied the whole yard together beautifully, creating a deep sense of natural harmony that she was always preaching about in her newsletters. She sputtered, literally spitting with rage, promising me that she would scour the rule books, that she would find a dozen bylaws to crush me, to which I simply smiled, a cold, mischievous glint in my eye, and wished her the best of luck, because officially, on paper, this was not a moat. It was a highly decorative, deeply necessary natural water retention feature. You see, I hadn't just dug a hole and filled it with a hose. I had meticulously engineered a thriving, self-sustaining ecosystem of pure, unadulterated spite, stocking the dark waters with dozens of vibrant, shimmering Japanese koi, scattering floating lily pads across the surface to create a shockingly beautiful, serene aesthetic that drove Brenda to the brink of a nervous breakdown. To truly drive the medieval point home, I had commissioned the construction of a massive, wildly unnecessary, ornately carved wooden drawbridge, complete with heavy iron chains and a rusty, dramatic creaking mechanism that groaned loudly every time I lowered it to check my mail. A theatrical addition that was utterly absurd but absolutely vital to the psychological warfare I was waging. The scale of this aquatic fortress was so breathtakingly massive that I genuinely considered buying a small gondola to traverse it, its sheer absurdity serving as a giant, unavoidable mirror reflecting the comical overreach of Brenda's own ridiculous regulations, magnified to a point where the entire neighborhood couldn't help but see the joke. When the HOA board inevitably descended upon my property like a swarm of angry, khaki-clad locusts, screaming about safety hazards and community spirit, I didn't yell back. Instead, I calmly walked over to the edge of the water and unveiled a beautifully painted, completely fabricated sign that read, "Warning, deep water. Do not feed the live alligators." Brenda nearly fainted, her eyes bulging out of her head as she stammered, her voice trembling with genuine terror, asking if there were actual, living, breathing apex predators swimming in the water surrounding my house, her paranoia instantly hijacking her rational thought. I raised an eyebrow, putting a hand to my chest in mock offense, telling her I would never dream of introducing such dangerous creatures into our peaceful community, at least, not without filing the proper paperwork first, which sent her into a spiraling panic, screaming that she was going to shut me down, that she was going to throw the entire legal weight of the HOA at me. That was the exact moment I reached into my bag and pulled out a massive, 2-inch thick binder of meticulously compiled legal documents, handing her an airtight, irrefutable report from Dr. Arthur Sterling, a highly respected, certified wetland specialist in Central Florida, who had officially designated my moat as a vital, legally protected environmental feature crucial for local groundwater retention and erosion control, completely immunizing it from any aesthetic bylaws the HOA could possibly throw at me. The sheer, suffocating frustration radiating from the Cypress Creek Homeowners Association headquarters over the next few weeks was palpable, a frantic, desperate scramble as they tore through decades of bylaws trying to find a single, usable loophole to drain my aquatic masterpiece. But my legal fortress was as impenetrable as the physical one surrounding my home. They were hopelessly entangled in their own obsessively constructed web of bureaucratic red tape, paralyzed by the very rules they had so ruthlessly used to terrorize ordinary families. But outsmarting them in the boardroom wasn't enough for me. I needed to elevate this petty conflict into the realm of local legend, which meant leaning heavily into the paranoia I had planted with those fake alligator signs. I strategically scattered more of those ominous warnings along the meticulously crafted, ridiculously expensive stone retaining walls I had hired landscapers to build around the perimeter, knowing full well the moat currently only housed harmless, oversized goldfish. But the psychological seed had been planted, and Brenda Vance's mind was rapidly watering it into a full-blown forest of terror. Her obsessive drive to catch me violating a major, indisputable law pushed her over the edge of sanity, leading her to embark on a rogue, unauthorized surveillance mission at dusk, creeping onto the edge of my property clad in a highly impractical, designer silk pantsuit, determined to prove to the neighborhood that the alligator threat was a bluff to intimidate her. I was sitting comfortably in my living room, sipping a glass of expensive bourbon, watching the live feed from my high-definition security cameras with bated breath, witnessing the glorious culmination of my planning as Brenda cautiously leaned her entire upper body over the edge of the water, her face inches from the lily pads, squinting into the murky depths. She was completely oblivious to the fact that I had intentionally, and perhaps slightly maliciously, loosened the locking mechanism on the heavy wooden planks of the drawbridge earlier that afternoon, leaving a subtle trap for anyone foolish enough to trespass on my fortress without permission. Just as she muttered to herself in triumphant satisfaction that there was nothing in the water, she shifted her weight onto the compromised plank, which gave way with a loud, theatrical crack, sending the reigning queen of the suburbs tumbling head over heels into the dark, surprisingly chilly waters of my natural retention feature. The splash was absolutely monumental, a chaotic explosion of water and scattering koi fish, and I had to bite my own knuckles to keep from screaming with laughter as she emerged from the depths, her luxurious pantsuit plastered to her skin, coughing up Moat water, draped elegantly in wet lily pads, and smelling strongly of fish emulsion, looking exactly like a B-movie swamp monster rising from the deep. The 4K security footage, which captured every glorious millisecond of her humiliating descent, was safely backed up to the cloud before she even managed to crawl her way up the muddy embankment, a digital artifact destined to become the most viral piece of media to ever originate from Orlando, Florida. But I knew Brenda would inevitably return with a vengeance. Attempting to use this accident to claim the property was a deadly hazard, so I decided to turn my bluff into a terrifying reality, completely legally. I contacted Suncoast Reptile Rescue, a licensed, deeply respected wildlife rehabilitation facility, and after filling out a surprising amount of paperwork where Moat pest control was apparently deemed a valid reason, I legally adopted 3 juvenile, incredibly docile American alligators, creatures no bigger than a golden retriever, who were perfectly content to sleep on floating logs and eat the fish I provided. When the HOA eventually returned the following morning, this time flanked by a cruiser from the Orange County Sheriff's Office, Brenda was practically foaming at the mouth, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the reptiles basking peacefully in the Florida sun, screaming at the police to arrest me for reckless endangerment and domestic terrorism. Officer Ramirez, a seasoned, deeply tired cop who looked like he had seen enough suburban drama to last a lifetime, approached the drawbridge cautiously, asking me in a weary tone if I was intentionally harboring dangerous apex predators in a residential zone. I just smiled politely, reached into my pocket, and handed him a crisp manila envelope containing my state-issued wildlife permits, adoption certificates, and the environmental report classifying the area as a protected habitat, watching with immense satisfaction as his expression shifted from stern authority to barely contained, shaking amusement. He handed the papers back, turned to a hyperventilating Brenda, and calmly explained that there was absolutely nothing he could legally do, as the animals were contained, fully permitted, and residing within a documented, sanctioned environment, before turning to me, tipping his hat, and advising me with a smirk to make sure I kept them well fed. The absolute, devastating defeat of the HOA was celebrated that weekend with a block party of epic, unprecedented proportions, a massive luau held on my driveway, featuring a towering sound system, catered barbecue, and a crowd of neighbors who had spent years suffering under Brenda's tyranny, all of us laughing until we cried as we watched the now infamous video of the Swamp Queen of Cypress Creek, playing on a loop on a projector screen. Brenda Vance resigned in complete, utter disgrace the very next morning, unable to show her face in the neighborhood without hearing the subtle, mocking croak of a frog from passing cars, completely dethroned by a man who refused to let his family's joy be legislated out of existence. To cement my victory and truly enjoy the fruits of my incredibly petty labor, I eventually hired a contractor to build a small, floating tiki bar in the dead center of the moat, complete with a thatched roof and neon lights, accessible only by a tiny, ridiculous rowboat, where I now spend my weekends sipping rum runners. watching my scaly guard dogs soak up the sun. The moat remains to this day a shimmering, undeniable monument to the power of malicious compliance, transforming my home into a local legend, a bizarre but beloved fixture of our community that constantly reminds everyone of the lengths a man will go to protect his peace. It makes you wonder, though, as you watch the sun set over the fortified walls of my suburban castle, where exactly do we draw the line between a community's right to maintain a unified standard and an individual's fundamental, God-given right to enjoy the property they paid for in whatever absurd, chaotic way they see fit?
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.